All right, so today we have Mr. Bill Brown, who is running for Senate District 23 in Lexington County. Thank you, Mr. Brown, for taking the time to talk with PSTA today. My name is Craig King. I'm Director of Teacher Leadership here at PSTA. Patrick Kelly had a meeting, so I'm taking over for him today.
Okay.
So we're just happy to have you here today.
Well, thank you. And by the way, you're showing up as Tony Tuning.
You know what? That's my coworker. Let me change that.
It's all right, Craig. It's fine.
That's funny. She's going to get a good laugh.
There we are. I see it.
There we go. Well, thanks for letting me know, Mr. Brown. And so we're going to jump right in. And again, thank you for taking the time to share with our members some of your thoughts about public education. We just have a few questions for you. But before we get into that, based on your, professional and personal experiences, we want to know, why you think having a strong public education system in South Carolina is so important. So please share a little bit about yourself so our members can get to know you a little bit, and also why public education, having a strong public education system is so important in South Carolina.
Super. I'm a Yankee transplant from Ohio. I moved down here 16 years ago, somewhere around maybe 15 years ago, with my wife. She's retired after teaching 32 years herself. She taught learning disabilities as well as first grade, and her last 2 years were spent teaching what was called pre-first in an Ohio school district. I had the opportunity to move south shortly after she retired. She retired in '02, and we sort of ended up in South Carolina just by chance more than anything else. I'm retired now. I'm 68. I retired from the IT department at Southeastern Freight Lines, which is a pretty good sized company-wide 8,000 employees. They do over $1 billion, but they're privately owned, not publicly owned. I work primarily on telecommunications in heavy trucks, and still do on a consulting basis. As to education, well, I'm glad you guys sent the questions ahead of time so I could give them a little bit of thought, and well, more than just a little. But I think if you just look at where we are right now, that the need for more education rather than less is more evident than ever. Jobs that have required a college degree were typically the most likely not to be furloughed during COVID. And frankly, at least from where I used to work, the bulk of the people that were allowed to work at home from the safety of their home were those that were college educated. Employers, if we look at new hires coming right out of school, employers don't really have work experience for those people other than maybe some part-time jobs while they were in college or high school. So in my experience, employers use an applicant's educational background as an indicator of success when someone doesn't yet have that work experience. And if you think about it, if I have an applicant from, say, South Carolina who went to South Carolina schools, and I have an applicant from, I don't know, let's just say Georgia, are Georgia schools ranked higher than South Carolina's? If so, I might tend to give a little more thought to the person from Georgia than from South Carolina. So it's critical that we in South Carolina compete with our regional neighbors. We have to show that we're as good as, if not better than they are, simply to level the playing field for new hires straight out of college or high school. Oops, you're muted, I believe.
Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for sharing that. I think you're my IT support today. Thank you. But thank you, and that your response really leads me into my next question. So, in South Carolina right now, we are experiencing a teacher shortage crisis. Last year, more than 6,500 teachers left our classrooms, resulting in 555 vacant teacher positions in our state in the 2019-20 school year. So in your opinion, how can the state address this teacher shortage crisis?
Correct me if I'm wrong. Here in South Carolina, does the state, as I understand it, they actually decide what every teacher is paid? It's not done at the school district level?
So there's a statewide minimum salary schedule that dictates what the minimum amount a school district can pay a teacher based on that statewide minimum salary schedule. Most school districts in the state decide to pay above that based on the revenue that they can produce locally. And so, so there is a statewide minimum salary schedule that stops at 23 years.
Okay.
But a lot of school districts go above that because of their tax base.
Okay, but I understand the need to stop at a certain point. I mean, I worked in private industry for years and years. I managed a portion of a department or two within trucking companies. We had pay ranges. You could earn, we called them pay grades, and you could earn from this much to this much. And if you hit the cap of your pay grade by year 12, well, that was the cap. You either had to find something better, more challenging, more worthwhile, or you were faced with that cap, which was reevaluated at a 5-10 year time frame. It was not something that was reevaluated annually. There were too many job descriptions to reevaluate. So having a cap at 23 years, does that say, well, no, okay, there's a cap. I don't have an issue with that. I think that I'm glad there's a statewide minimum, for gosh sakes, could you imagine if there weren't? I think there needs to be some consideration in terms of, from a teacher retention standpoint, in terms of, let's talk about school districts that don't have a great deal of funding. Not my term, it's one that I learned when I moved here. It's called the, if I remember right, the highway of shame.
Corridor of shame.
Corridor of shame, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, that when I moved here and I heard that one, what? And I drove it just to see. And wow. So things that come to my mind, if a school district's going to have a challenge retaining teachers, likely it's the school districts that are in lesser desirable areas of the state. They're going to lose their teachers to school districts. If they even stay in the state of South Carolina, they're likely to lose teachers to school districts that are in more desirable areas. So how about considering something along the lines of the state providing some kind of funded, I don't know if you'd call it reward, I don't know what the word is, but an inducement. For example, how about, hey, if you'll relocate and live within our district, we'll pay you this much more than if you live outside our district and commute. On the other hand, you might also consider adding some level of funding so that even the commute time, I mean, if a teacher has to drive 45 minutes to get to the school district where he or she teaches, and forgive me, I'm the old school, I'll probably say she more often than he, simply because my wife taught and I'm used to teachers being female. But it could be that some kind of mechanism could be put in place to induce teachers to either consider those school districts that are in more need than others, or to keep them in those school districts and not have them leave for other school districts within the state. Certainly pay scales should be relevant and comparable to our regional competition of Georgia, Florida, North Carolina. It's one thing to be paying less than New York, and the fact that we compete with New York at some degree, okay, so what? We also compete with California. Come on. The cost of living here, the whole area isn't comparable. So I think we must be competitive with our regional, within our regional area. And we have to consider perhaps improving pay scales for the school districts in the lesser desirable corridor of shame area.
Thank you. Thank you for that response, Mr. Brown. As we go into talking about education a little bit more, so our state Supreme Court ruled that the General Assembly has a constitutional obligation to ensure a minimally adequate system of free schools open to all children of our state. What do you view as the most important actions the General Assembly should take to meet and exceed the constitutional requirement on behalf of all children in South Carolina?
Okay, I'm gonna not comment on my belief that minimally adequate is insufficient. We'll leave it at that.
You can share whatever you want our members to know, sir.
I believe that every physical school, I mean, think about this just for a second. I'm going to comment minimally adequate. Come on. Anyway, I believe that every physical school has to be well maintained with roofs that don't leak and environmental systems that function. And by environmental, I mean heating and air conditioning. I've driven past some of those schools, but I haven't been in them that lead me to scratch my head. Teachers certainly need to be properly licensed, and a form of evaluation with defined remedial steps should be published. For example, rewarding well-funded schools that do well on the testing, the statewide testing, might be the reverse of what would more likely level the playing field. In other words, have they considered, hey, schools that do really well, instead of giving them extra funding, how about we hold the funding and look at the schools that haven't done particularly well, define what needs to be changed, and if that change requires funding, now we have some. I have to add that parents have a level of responsibility too, and I'm not sure that that particular expectation is clearly defined and actually enforced. After 32 years of my wife teaching, I heard a lot in that regard. A school district can do little to provide remote learning in areas that lack even a cellular signal. So, the state needs to belly up, in my opinion, because I believe remote learning is going to be with us more than just this school year. I think they need to belly up and figure out a way to handle the broadband infrastructure improvements. For example, some houses, some residences may not even have a telephone. They may not be able to even afford a cell phone, but you can get a Wi-Fi hotspot for $25 a month. I know, because I just bought one from T-Mobile, $25 a month. For residences that need some supplemental, that simply can't afford to have broadband, how about the state providing something such as that? $25 a month per household. Come on, that's cheap. Now, certainly the household needs to be responsible, but once they're given a device, they can't sell it. They have to make sure that Rover doesn't chew on it. They have to put some risk. They have to accept some responsibility. And I think once that's laid out, why not? Let's provide that infrastructure. We could do that very rapidly in areas that at least have a cell signal. For areas that don't have cell, I'm not sure there's a really great solution other than satellite that is pricier. I don't know how much pricier.
Well, thank you. And we agree, Mr. Brown, about minimally adequate. We think it should keep that. So we're on the same page as that. So we're in agreement. And I'm sure our members that are going to view this will agree with you as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Governor McMaster recently announced that he hopes the General Assembly will pass a permanent version of the SAFE grants program for private school scholarships in the coming session. So what are your thoughts on state-funded scholarships or voucher programs in K-12 education?
You're going to love my first response, but you won't like my follow-up. My first one is that shouldn't happen. You don't fund scholarships to private schools, period. I say that I grew up and I went through the parochial school system in Ohio. That's a private school system. You know what? I remember the late 60s. I'm old enough to remember the late 60s and early 70s. In the late 60s, the Archbishop of Cincinnati was tired of having a situation where every parent that paid their taxes still had to pay for everything, every nickel of the child's education in the parochial system. So you know what the Archbishop did? He waited until the end of the school year and announced publicly at the end of the school year that starting in September, he was closing every first grade in the state. Everyone. You talk about hitting the state hard. That hit them. They couldn't build classrooms fast enough. They couldn't fund it. They couldn't afford it. What was the point? The point was the settlement that came about. The state agreed that, you know what, a history book's a history book. How about the state will assist in funding school supplies? The state will assist in funding cleaning supplies. The state assisted in funding textbooks, not secular textbooks, you know, religious books, but for gosh sakes, history and English. Whether the state pays for that book for the student that ends up in the state system, or they pay for the book that's in the parochial or private, if you will. Here in South Carolina, it's typically not necessarily parochial. It's the same expense. And as a taxpayer, why should parents have to pay twice? So no, scholarships, no. I don't want to weaken the public school system because I believe there would be a mad rush to send students to some of the private schools. But lessening the cost of those private schools to some extent by sharing some of the ordinary costs of education, I think is appropriate.
Thank you for your response. And finally, multiple members of the General Assembly have noted the desire to break up Senate Bill 419, the Education Reform Bill, into multiple components and pass them individually. So what do you consider the single most important educational reform that the General Assembly can enact next legislative session? What would be your number one education priority?
It would be a toss-up. So I'm gonna, there's two that rank up there, but I'll pick one of the two, and that's redefining testing. Teaching to the test has to stop. And I think the best way to stop it is to take a step back from it and define what it is you expect the tests to prove. And if a school district actually is proving that they are teaching well enough that an appropriate number of students pass the test. Do I think every student should pass the statewide testing? If so, the test is probably inadequate. It's supposed to be a challenge, I think. And there are going to be students that can't quite hack it. Okay, but when the results are in and they find out, going back to my earlier comment, they find out that school district A didn't quite make it. Well, instead of rewarding the ones that did, how about figuring out how better to allocate those funds? I'm not saying that you should pay a school for failing. I'm saying that there should be a study with prescribed, these are the things that would fix the issue and raise those schools up to the desired levels. And if that took money to do that, then fund it. Don't throw the money. It's one thing to reward people for doing exceptionally well. It's another thing to help people that could do better with some help. So I think redefining testing is primary. Secondary, I have to say ranking right up there, because I think remote learning is with us for a long time, is broadband infrastructure, finding some way to get that out into the areas that it needs to be. Oh, you're muted again.
Muted again. Thank you, tech support. I try to do that so any background noise isn't picked up. But thank you so much for sharing your comments to our questions. But I do want to give you a chance to share anything else that you wanted to share that wasn't asked, that you want our members to know about Bill Brown and your race and your candidacy.
Well, I'll toss this out. After 32 years of teaching, if I ever did anything to the detriment of a school system or of a teacher, I've been married 42 years now. I don't know that I'd make 43. My wife is proud of her time spent teaching. I am too. She won't let me screw that up. I wish you all luck.
I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
No, I wish you all luck.
Thank you so much for taking the time, Mr. Brown, and we'll make sure that you receive this link, and we'll share it on social media so that our members can listen to your comments on public education, and have a good day.
You bet. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.